The day my daughter told me my room belongs to the dog, and the moment my life snapped into 1,000 quiet pieces, I never saw coming, and this is my real life story I would like to share for big lesson. My name is Richard Green, and at 56 years old I thought I had lived through the hardest blows life could throw at a man. But nothing ever prepared me for the morning my own daughter stood at my doorway with a look colder than winter frost, and told me plain and clear that my room was now the dog's room, and I should start thinking about moving my things out. And made I swear I felt the air leave my chest like someone punched straight through my ribs. And for a moment I kept waiting for her to smirk or laugh or say she was joking, or that it was some wild Aussie-style tease. But there was no smile on her face, and no spark of humor in her eyes, only a flat, silent hardness that told me she meant every single word she said. And the hallway around us felt so still that I could hear my own heartbeat banging inside my ears. And I kept standing there holding onto the doorframe like an old man who needed something to stop him from collapsing, because I could not make sense of how my own flesh and blood could talk to me like that after everything I had done for her, after every sacrifice, every long night, every tired morning, every moment. I pushed myself to the side so she could stand strong and walk forward. And now, she looked at me like I was some unwanted visitor who overstayed his welcome in his own home. And I tried to swallow, but my throat felt tight like the words were trapped and fighting to break out. And all I could think was, how did we get here? How did the little girl who used to run into my arms crying after school turn into a woman who could push me aside without even blinking? And as she stood there pointing to the little dog bed she placed right in the middle of my room, a space I had lived in for decades, a space filled with memories of late-night prayers, of quiet mornings, of long hours repairing old radios, and mending small things that made me feel useful. I felt something inside me twisting and tearing. And it was not just anger, it was not just hurt, it was something deeper, something like heartbreak mixed with confusion, mixed with an old tired pain that comes when the people you love forget who you really are and treat you like you mean nothing. And I felt the slow rising fire building in my chest, not the kind that explodes loud, but the kind that burns steady and fierce, and tells you that something is wrong, something is unfair, and something inside you will not let this slide. And I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing the face of the child I raised. And I said her name. Softly hopping, maybe she would hear the pain in my voice and soften. But she did not. She just repeated her words, telling me that the dog needed comfort, and she needed more space. And I should understand, because it was not a big deal, and those words hit me harder than the first, because she said it like my comfort, my dignity, my place in my own house did not matter at all. And I felt this heavy loneliness settle on my shoulders, as if the world had shifted and I had no place left to stand. And in that moment, I realized something that felt like a blade running deep through the middle of my chest, that sometimes betrayal does not come from enemies or outsiders. Sometimes it comes from the people you love the most, and the people you trusted and protected and believed would never turn on you. And as I watched her walk away down the hallway like she had simply told me to move a chair or sweep a floor, I knew that something inside me had changed forever, and that this moment was not just a disrespectful comment. This was the beginning of a storm that would drag all three of us into places none of us could imagine. And I felt a fire rising inside me telling me that justice would come, not loud, not messy, but steady and quiet and certain. Because no father deserves to be treated like a stray who lost his place in his own home. And I promised myself right then that this story would not end with me broken. This story would end with truth and consequence, and with me reclaiming the dignity they tried to take from me. I was a simple man who lived a steady, ordinary life, and even though there was nothing fancy or flashy about the path I walked, I carried a heart full of purpose, because every single day of my adult life was shaped around one goal, which was giving my daughter Emma the kind of childhood and future I never had. And I worked long shifts fixing home appliances for almost 30 years, waking before the sun, and returning home long after most people had settled in for the night. And through all those years I saved every extra dollar, every overtime payment, every tiny bonus, because I wanted her to have opportunities that I only dreamed about when I was young. And when my wife passed away and left me alone with a 14-year-old daughter who still cried herself to sleep some nights, I stepped into both roles without hesitation. And I did school runs and cooked breakfast and packed lunches and stood outside classrooms waiting for parent meetings, even when I was so tired that my knees shook, and I listened to her. Late-night fears when she whispered that she did not understand why her mother had to leave so early, and I held her close telling her that I would stand by her for the rest of my life, and I meant every word because I believed that love was proven through action, not through empty talk. And even when money was tight and bills piled up, I never let her see the weight of my struggles, because I wanted her to grow up without fear, without worry, without feeling like life owed her anything. And when she stepped into adulthood, I felt this sharp pride in my chest watching her take her first job and make her first decisions, even though she slowly began drifting away from me, spending more time with friends, staying out late, treating the house like a motel, and me like a tired old service worker who was there to clean up after her. But still, I kept giving because fathers do not turn off their love, and I kept hoping that one day she would pause long enough to see the depth of my sacrifices and understand that every moment of her life was built on years of my hard work, my patience, and my devotion. And even when she looked right through me as if I was fatting into the walls of our home, I held on to the belief that the girl who used to hug me tight after school would come back and realize that her father had never once walked away, no matter how heavy life became. Emma met a new boyfriend just around the time she turned 24, and she insisted on bringing him home one weekend to meet me. And at first I thought maybe it was just another harmless relationship, another boy who would fade away eventually. But mate, from the moment he shook my hand, I felt a cold weight settle in my chest, because there was something about him that did not sit right. And his eyes never stayed still, they darted here and there, scanning the room like he was measuring it and me and everything. And he carried this fake confidence like a thin mask, stretched over a whole lot of nothing, and I could feel it pressing against me, almost daring me to challenge it. And as he walked through my home, he moved like he owned every square inch, opening cupboards, peeking in drawers, sitting in my favorite recliner like it was his throne, and speaking loud and rough, calling me old fella, as if he was doing me a favor just by being in the house. And I watched my daughter laugh at every word he said, even when he poked fun at me or made sly comments about my age and my life. And I forced a smile, because fathers learn to bite their tongue when it means keeping their child happy and safe, even when the gut tells you danger is near. And deep down I knew this man would bring nothing but trouble into our lives. And the warning bells in my head rang louder when we sat down for dinner, and he started talking about how parents should step aside when their kids grow up, and how older people should not hold on to things too long. And the sting of his words cut straight through me as if he had aimed at my very soul. And Emma noticed what he said, but she did not defend me, not a single word. And that silence spoke volumes, louder than any argument could have told me that she had started seeing the world through his eyes, and that our bond that I had spent decades building was already under threat. And as I sat there listening to him talk and watching my daughter smile and nod at his every word, I felt a quiet dread settle in my bones, and I knew that my life was about to change forever, and that the man I had just met would be the one to shake the foundation of everything I had built with love, patience, and sacrifice. And in that moment, I realized that love alone would not protect me from the coming storm, and that I would have to fight in ways I never imagined to hold on to the life and dignity I had spent 56 years shaping. Weeks passed after that unsettling dinner, and slowly little things began to change in my home, in ways that at first I told myself were harmless and temporary. And perhaps I was just being old and overly cautious. But Emma began leaving her things in my bedroom, claiming she needed more space in her own room, which she now shared more often with that bloke. And I told myself not to make a fuss, because fathers are taught to be patient and quiet, and to put their child's comfort first, even when it comes at the cost of their own dignity. And at first it was small things like a jacket or a backpack left on my chair, and I moved them aside thinking I would tidy it later and maybe tomorrow things would be back to normal. But slowly, day by day, it escalated, and her clothes, her shoes, her makeup, and little trinkets began creeping into every drawer, every shelf, and every corner of the room. until it felt like my space was shrinking around me, suffocating me. And I tried to convince myself that maybe it was temporary, maybe she just needed a little help organizing her stuff. But the truth whispered to me every night when I lay in the living room staring at the empty walls that my sanctuary was no longer mine. And one evening, I came home from work, exhausted, sweaty and bone, tired from hours of lifting and bending, fixing things that no longer felt satisfying, because my mind was heavy with worry. And I opened the door to my bedroom and found him lying on my bed scrolling his phone like he was the king of the house, like the world revolved around him. And he did not even lift his head when he saw me. He just smirked and said the bed was comfy and that I should be glad someone was actually using it, as if my comfort did not matter at all. And the worst part of that moment was Emma standing nearby, laughing lightly, telling me to relax, to not take it too seriously, to stop being so dramatic. And mate, that was the first time in my life I felt like a guest in my own home, a man who had given decades of his life for his daughter, now reduced to a stranger in his own space. And yet, like a fool, I stayed silent. I bit my tongue and tried to convince myself that maybe everything would settle down, that maybe it was just a phase, and that I was reading too much into it. But deep inside, a voice in my head screamed, "Richard, this is not respect, this is not love, this is the start of betrayal." And I chose to ignore it, telling myself that perhaps patience and quiet endurance would fix what I could not yet name. And that was the first step in letting the storm grow, because every time I ignored the small signs of disrespect, I allowed them to inch closer to taking what was rightfully mine. And the weight of that choice settled heavy on my chest, even as I tried to sleep that night, imagining the bed that had been mine being occupied by someone who had no claim on it. And I realized that ignoring the first signs of betrayal had opened the door wide enough for it to walk right in and take up residence in my life, in my home, without permission, and that the man and the daughter I loved so deeply were already beginning to rewrite the rules of my world in ways I was not ready to fight against yet. That Sunday morning will stay burned into my memory for as long as I live, the kind of memory that doesn't fade with time but grows sharper, heavier, and more painful every time I think about it. I remember stepping through the front door earlier than usual, still smelling faintly of grease and metal from the repair job I had just finished. I was tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from honest work, from knowing I had done my best for the day and could come home to rest. But the second I walked into the living room, a strange chill crept over me, because what I saw made my heart stop mid-beat. There on the table I had polished with my own hands were my most important papers, my will, my savings records, the deed to my house, all spread out like dirty laundry for strangers to examine. They were tossed around carelessly, as if they were nothing but cheap flyers someone had picked from the trash. And then I saw Emma sitting there, my daughter, the child I had raised with hands that never stopped working and a heart that never stopped loving. She was next to her boyfriend, a man who had never done a single thing for me or for her, a man who looked up at me with a smug, lazy confidence, leaning back like he owned the place, like he had every right to be there, poking into the life I had built. My stomach twisted, and a coldness settled into my bones, because deep down I knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. That was not the face of a helpful son-in-law. That was the face of someone who believed he was about to win something. My voice came out shaky when I asked what they were doing, and instead of the guilt or respect I expected, Emma simply looked at me with annoyance, as if I were interrupting her business in my own home. She told me lightly, almost casually, not to worry myself because they were helping me reorganize. Reorganize? What a small word for such a big wrong. She said it as if I were some old man who could no longer understand the world, as if my hands weren't still working every day, as if my mind wasn't still sharp. She said it like the years I spent raising her, breaking my back to make sure she never lacked anything, meant absolutely nothing. Her boyfriend didn't move. He didn't apologize. He didn't even pretend to show respect. He just kept sitting back, arms folded, giving me a look that made my blood boil, like he had already calculated how much everything was worth, like he was already imagining a future where my life's work belonged to them. And still, I held myself together, swallowing the anger that clawed at my throat because I didn't want to explode. I didn't want another shouting match. I didn't want to drive my daughter further away. So I forced calm into my voice even though inside something was breaking. But then came the moment that sliced straight into my soul. Emma walked toward me with a stack of papers in her hand and told me I should start signing a few things to make life easier for everyone. For everyone. As if my life existed only to serve their comfort. As if everything I had built with sweat and sacrifice was now theirs to distribute. My vision blurred for a moment, and it felt like the room was spinning because there was no hesitation in her voice. No shame, no guilt, no hesitation whatsoever. That was the instant I saw the truth, not a crack, not a hint, but the full, ugly truth of their intentions. They weren't helping me. They weren't organizing anything. They weren't thinking about my old age, my comfort, or my well-being. They were planning. They were calculating. They were scheming. Right in my own home, under my roof, on my table, using my blood, my sweat, my years of sacrifice as bargaining chips. When she pushed those papers closer, expecting me to sign without reading, without questioning, something inside me finally snapped. Not loudly, not violently, but silently, like a rope that had been stretched too tight for too long. And in that quiet, devastating moment, I understood something I never wanted to believe. The betrayal wasn't coming. It was already here, sitting in front of me, smiling, pretending to care while preparing to take everything from me. That was the moment my daughter showed her true colors, and once you see a person's true colors, you can never unsee them again. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those long dragging days when the sun feels too hot and the work feels too heavy and all you want is to get home, wash your face, sit on your bed and breathe for a moment. I remember walking in through the front door, sweat sticking to my shirt, my hands aching from hours of repairing broken appliances, my back tight from bending and lifting. I was exhausted, but I carried that familiar relief inside me, the relief of coming home to the one place that had always been mine, the one space where I could rest, think, pray, and gather the scattered pieces of my day. But the moment I stepped into the hallway, something felt off. The air felt different, colder somehow, as if the house itself was holding its breath. And then I reached my bedroom doorway and froze. Right in the middle of the room, my room, was a large dog bed, fluffy, brand new, and placed with a kind of confidence that made my stomach twist. My photos, the ones I'd kept for years, pictures of my late wife, memories of Emma when she was little, moments I held close to my heart were gone from the walls. The shelves were empty. The bedside table was bare. Everything that had made that room mine had vanished. I looked down and saw my belongings, my clothes, my tools, my books, stacked carelessly near the door like someone had swept them aside in a hurry, like they were clutter, like they were trash waiting to be thrown out. I stood there unable to move for a moment, unable to understand what my eyes were seeing. It felt like the ground under me shifted, like the house I had built with love and sweat was no longer my home but some strange place where I didn't belong. And then Emma appeared in the doorway, her hands on her hips, her expression sharp, irritated, impatient, like I was the one intruding. She didn't look embarrassed or guilty. She didn't even look surprised to see me standing there. She just said it plainly, as if her decision carried all the logic in the world. The dog needed more space, and my room was perfect for him. She said it like it was reasonable. She said it like it was normal. She said it like demoting her father to a storage closet was just another household adjustment. My ears rang as she talked, going on and on about how the dog had trouble sleeping, how he needed comfort, how the storage room in the back was enough for me since I didn't need much anyway. And in her voice, there was no kindness, none. Just a cold stiffness that made me feel like a stranger, like a burden, like someone taking up space she no longer wanted me to fill. The words hit me one after another until my heart felt bruised. I looked around the room again. The same room I had slept in for decades. The room where I had prayed every night for my daughter's happiness. The room where I had cried quietly after losing my wife. The room where I had fixed little things at a small desk because it gave me peace. That room, my sacred space, was now being handed over to a dog without hesitation. And then her boyfriend walked in, swaggering like he owned the house, brushing past me and bumping my shoulder on purpose. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look at me. He just smirked and said, "Move your stuff, old-timer," with a tone dripping in mockery, old-timer, as if I were nothing more than a tired old man standing in the way of their comfort. That one little phrase carried so much disrespect that it stung more than a slap. I felt something deep inside me twist, something that had been holding on for far too long. In that moment, something broke inside me. Not with noise, not with shouting, but with a quiet heaviness that began in my chest and spread through my bones. A slow, painful snap, the kind of break that doesn't heal easily. I realized I wasn't just losing a room. I wasn't just losing privacy or comfort or space. I was losing dignity. I was losing respect. I was losing the father-daughter bond I had believed in for years. But more dangerously, I was losing myself. If I stayed silent, if I allowed them to shove me into a storage closet like forgotten furniture, then there would be nothing left of me except a shadow living in the corners of my own home. Standing there with their voices buzzing around me, their disrespect filling the room that used to belong to me, I understood something clearly for the first time. Betrayal doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the shape of a dog bed placed in the middle of a father's sacred space. Sometimes it comes in your child's voice when she tells you to move aside as if your presence no longer matters. And sometimes it walks past you with a smirk, calling you old, pushing you out of the life you built with your own hands. And that was the day, on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, that I realized if I didn't stand up now, if I didn't protect what little I had left, I would disappear entirely from the life I had spent years building. It was the day my own daughter took my room away, and with it, she almost took the last piece of me. That night, after the humiliating day when my own daughter had taken over my room and treated me like I was a guest in my own home, I didn't go to sleep. I sat on the back porch alone, the kind of porch that had seen decades of my quiet reflections, the nights I spent thinking about my late wife, about my daughter growing up, about the life I had built brick by brick with my own hands. The air was heavy with the scent of damp grass and the faint whiff of the street beyond, and the wind whispered softly through the trees as if the world was waiting to hear what I would do next. I stared at the dark yard, at the shadows of things I had once tended, and for a long while I just sat quietly letting the weight of everything settle over me. The betrayal, the disrespect, the slow realization that the people I had given everything to were now plotting to take what was mine. I thought about every sacrifice I had made, every dollar saved, every late night spent working instead of sleeping, every time I held back my own needs so that Emma could have hers, and the ache in my chest was so strong I could almost feel it physically pressing against my ribs. It hurt to think that all those years, all that love, all that effort might be wiped away by a moment of selfishness, by the reckless ambition of a stranger and my own child who had forgotten the man who raised her. And yet, amid that pain, a fire began to grow inside me. Not the kind that rages and destroys blindly, but a slow, steady fire that warms the heart and sharpens the mind. A fire that says you will not be walked over, you will not be erased, and you will take action because your life, your dignity, your future are worth defending. I made a promise to myself right there in the quiet dark, sitting on that porch where the night seemed to hold its breath with me, that I would no longer allow them to treat me like a doormat, that I would no longer sit silently while my own home and my own life were slowly stolen from me. The plan began not out of anger, not out of rage, but out of survival, the kind of survival that requires patience, foresight, and careful steps, because I knew exactly what they wanted. My property, my savings, control over the home and the life I had built with decades of work, and control over me as a person who had trusted them. The first step, I realized, had to be to stop trusting them completely. If I continued to assume they would act with decency or honesty, I would lose everything. So that night I quietly gathered all my most important documents, the ones that proved my ownership, my accounts, my life's work, and I moved them to a safe place that only I knew about. A place that was hidden not just from prying eyes but from anyone who might try to manipulate me. I sat there looking at the papers in my hands, and I felt a strange mixture of grief and hope, because for the first time I felt in control again, in a way I had not felt in months, in a way I had not allowed myself to feel because I had been so focused on trusting and giving that I had forgotten to protect myself. The next day I met with an old friend, a man I had known for decades who worked in real estate and understood how property, law, and ownership worked in ways I did not always remember after years of manual labor and living day by day. I told him everything slowly, carefully, without raising my voice because the fire inside me was steady, controlled, deliberate, and I explained that I wanted to make changes to my will without letting Emma know, because if she saw me moving first, she would accelerate her plans and I could not let that happen. My friend listened quietly, nodding occasionally, his face grave but understanding, and when I finished he told me with a calm certainty that I was doing the right thing, that securing my assets, my home, my life from someone who was clearly ready to take advantage was not selfish but necessary, that sometimes protecting yourself from betrayal is the only act of justice you can perform. That simple meeting, that quiet night of reflection on the porch, became the beginning of my silent justice, the first small step in reclaiming control over a life that had been slipping away for months. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of power, not the kind that seeks revenge blindly, but the kind that comes from knowing you are finally taking back what is yours in the only way that will truly protect you, your dignity, and the life you fought so hard to build. And as I left that meeting and drove back home with the papers safely tucked away, I knew that nothing would ever be the same, that the quiet night of planning had sparked a chain of decisions that would change everything for them and for me, and that from now on I would no longer be a silent observer in my own life, but a careful strategist making sure that betrayal would never win again. The days after, I began quietly securing my documents and making subtle plans for my own protection felt heavy, almost unbearable, because I could see the audacity of Emma and her boyfriend growing like a storm cloud over the house I had built with my own hands and the life I had shaped with sweat and sacrifice. They acted bolder each day, moving through my home as if the walls themselves belonged to them, taking over space that had been mine for decades, leaving belongings scattered, piling up their shoes and clothes in corners I had once called my sanctuary, and using my money as though it was theirs to spend. They ordered food without asking, used my tools without permission, even made jokes about my old ways and how my ideas about fixing and maintaining the house were outdated. And it was becoming clearer with each passing moment that they were no longer pretending to care or show respect. They were assuming ownership. It was subtle at first, but the pattern was unmistakable. They laughed together when I looked at them, glances exchanged across rooms full of memories I had made with my late wife, memories of laughter and quiet evenings, the walls still holding echoes of our lives, and they treated it all as if it had no meaning, as if their comfort mattered more than every hour I had spent making this house a home. And then one night, the betrayal that I had feared but had tried to ignore finally became undeniable. I had pretended to sleep, though my mind was racing with calculations and possibilities, but I was awake long enough to hear them in the kitchen whispering to each other in hushed tones, thinking I was asleep, thinking I could not hear them, thinking I could not see what they were planning. They talked about me with a casual arrogance, the kind of arrogance only someone completely blinded by greed can carry, and what they said made my blood run cold. They spoke about convincing me to sign over ownership of the house soon, about how easy it would be to get me to agree if they pushed gently enough, about how soon they could sell it, move somewhere fancier, spend the money however they wanted, and leave me with nothing. And mate, my breath caught in my throat because that home was more than just walls and a roof. That home was built with my sweat, nights I stayed awake fixing leaks, mornings I rose before dawn to patch up broken things, and the love and labor of my late wife were etched into every corner, every shelf, every beam, every window. And these two, my own daughter and a man I had met only months before, were planning to toss it aside like it meant nothing, like it was rubbish waiting to be discarded. I could hear them laughing together, their voices light and joking as if the idea of casting aside a father's life work were a game, a harmless bit of fun. They mocked me softly, calling me out of touch, too soft to ever fight back, too old and sentimental to matter in the grand plans they were hatching, and hearing Emma, my own daughter, giggle along with him cut deeper than any insult I had ever endured in my life. The betrayal was not just in their words, but in the complete disregard for me, for everything I had done, for every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every decision made for her future. It was not the first time I had felt hurt, but it was the first time I truly understood that they had already written me out of the story of my own life, and they believed I would never see it, never notice, never react. At that moment, as I sat there frozen in the dark of my bedroom doorway, heart hammering, blood cold in my veins, I knew without a shadow of doubt that they believed me weak. They believed that my age, my patience, my love, my tendency to forgive and ignore minor slights meant that I could be walked over, that I would allow them to steal what I had built. But I also knew something else, a slow and steady realization that gave me a quiet, dangerous strength. That belief would be their biggest mistake. They were counting on me to remain passive, to allow betrayal and greed to triumph, to stand aside and watch as the life I had worked for was dismantled before my eyes. And I understood then that they were wrong in the worst possible way, because the fire I had nurtured in silence over the past weeks, the careful planning that had begun with one quiet night on the back porch, the steady accumulation of patience and foresight, had reached a point where action was inevitable. Their audacity had revealed everything. Their mockery had shown me their plans, and from that moment forward, nothing they did could blind me to the truth. Nothing they said could intimidate me, and nothing they thought about my weakness would ever be accurate again, because I had seen them for who they really were, and I had decided I would act carefully, deliberately, and in a way that they would never expect. That night, the betrayal they thought I would never see became the turning point, the spark that ignited a fire that would reclaim what was mine and teach them that a father's dignity is not something to be taken lightly. One quiet morning, before the first stirrings of the house awoke and before Emma or her boyfriend could rise to challenge or question me, I quietly began packing my clothes, my tools, and the few belongings that still carried meaning for me. The things that reminded me who I was, and who I had been before their disrespect and betrayal had begun to overshadow my life. Each item I placed carefully into bags felt like a small reclaiming of myself, a reclaiming of dignity, a quiet rebellion against the way they had tried to erase me from my own home. I moved with deliberate calm, stepping through the rooms that had once been full of memories, the walls that had heard my laughter and my grief, touching each surface lightly, as if saying goodbye to a past I could never return to in the same way. The air was still, heavy with the early morning hush, and I felt a sense of freedom mixed with sorrow as I walked out the front door for the last time without saying a single word, without the drama, without the confrontation I knew they were expecting. I drove to a small rental place I had arranged in secret, a modest space that was mine, safe, and untouchable by the people who had betrayed me. And as I signed the agreement on the spot, I felt the first flicker of hope in weeks, the kind of hope that comes not from revenge, but from the restoration of one's autonomy. I had taken steps they could not anticipate, steps that required patience, secrecy, and careful planning. And for the first time since the betrayal had begun, I felt the power of acting decisively, quietly, and without their knowledge. After securing the rental, I went to my lawyer and finalized a new will, a will that would ensure my life's work, my property, and everything I had labored to protect would never be misused by those who did not understand respect, gratitude, or the value of hard work. In that will, I left everything to a community shelter that helped struggling families, people who had earned the right to appreciate the weight of what they received, who understood what it meant to fight and to care for others. And in that moment, I realized that giving my life's treasures to those who valued them was far more satisfying than allowing them to fall into the hands of someone who would treat them as disposable. Then I took the most important step. I transferred ownership of the house into a trust that Emma could not touch, not now and not ever. Every wall, every floorboard, every corner that had once been mine alone was protected, no longer vulnerable to manipulation or greed. The act was simple on paper, yet the effect was monumental. By the time the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the yard, I had moved my life completely away from them. The weight that had pressed on my shoulders for months lifted, replaced by a quiet satisfaction that comes from taking control when all others assumed you were powerless. I knew it would not take long before Emma noticed something was amiss. Sure enough, her call came, sharp and tinged with confusion and rising panic, asking where the house keys were, asking what had happened, demanding to know why her plans had suddenly hit an immovable wall. I answered calmly, deliberately, letting the silence hang for a long moment before I said she should check with the authorities because the property was no longer under my personal control. The effect was immediate. Her voice went quiet, stunned, broken even by the simple truth I had delivered. She had never imagined I would act, never imagined I would take the quiet, calculated steps necessary to protect myself. And in that silence, heavier than any shouting, I knew she realized everything had slipped from her hands. For the first time in months, I felt truly alive, unburdened and in control. And in that quiet victory, I understood that reclaiming your life does not always come with confrontation or shouting. Sometimes it comes with patience, careful planning and decisive action taken when the world is asleep, and the ones who betrayed you least expect it. That day, the day I moved, changed everything, not just for Emma or her boyfriend, but for me. I had reclaimed my dignity, my autonomy, and my life. And in the stillness of the evening, as I watched the sunset from my new window, I finally felt the peace that comes when justice is delivered quietly but completely. When Emma and her boyfriend finally realized that the house was no longer available for their schemes, that the property they had assumed would be theirs by manipulation and disrespect had been placed completely out of their reach, their reaction was explosive, a storm of anger, frustration, and disbelief that filled the empty spaces they had treated as their own kingdom for so long. I could hear the sharpness in Emma's voice as she called me selfish, dramatic, impossible to please, as if I had ruined not just her plans but her entire future, as if her comfort and sense of entitlement mattered more than the decades I had spent building the life she had taken for granted. She begged, pleaded even, asking me to undo what I had done, to return the property, to restore the room, the house, the life she had believed she had the right to inherit before she was ready to earn it. I listened quietly, my face calm, my hands steady, because I had already stepped beyond the rage that had once burned in my chest. I had realized long ago that acting in anger would only satisfy their illusions of control. Instead, I spoke slowly and firmly, letting each word carry the weight of experience and the quiet fire that had grown inside me for months, telling her that respect works both ways, that love is earned through understanding, kindness, and gratitude, and that the moment she chose greed over care for the family that raised her, she had lost the right to stand in my home as she pleased or to assume what belonged to me. Her boyfriend tried to step forward, his face twisted with frustration, his voice rising, wild claims spilling from him, Threats delivered with a confidence that he clearly believed would intimidate me. But mate, I had nothing to fear anymore. I had protected everything that mattered, every asset, every bit of security, every corner of my life that had been vulnerable to their scheming. I simply walked away, letting their shouting bounce off walls that were no longer mine to defend physically, but mine to control through the steps I had taken. And in that moment, I felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally reclaimed authority over a life that had been slipping away for too long. Days later, as the reality of their loss sank in, they were forced to move out entirely, stripped of any legal claim, powerless to remain in the home they had once treated as their own, and the dog room they had carved out from my sanctuary went back to being empty and unused, a silent reminder of the audacity and the hubris that had led them to believe they could take what was not theirs. Neighbors told me later that Emma began to realize just how far she had fallen, how her choices, her betrayal, and her willingness to side with greed over family had altered her life in ways she could not repair. And I could hear the subtle sorrow in the retelling, the weight of regret that had finally found its way to her. But by that time, regret could do nothing to restore the trust that had been broken, the respect that had been denied, or the years she had allowed herself to drift away from the father who loved her unconditionally. The house remained protected, the life I had built remained intact, and I realized then that betrayal, once done, is a wound that cannot be stitched back into perfection. It leaves a scar, a permanent reminder of choices made, of trust broken, and of lessons learned too late. And in that quiet aftermath, as I sat in my new space looking back on what had been and what had been lost, I felt a deep, unshakable peace because I had acted when it mattered most. I had protected my dignity, my home, my future, and though the pain of betrayal lingered, I had turned it into strength, into strategy, into a life that no one could take from me again. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled knowing that justice, quiet and deliberate, had been served. Now, years later, I live in a small, peaceful place tucked away near a quiet road where the mornings are gentle, and the sunlight spills over the porch in slow golden waves that warm the skin and soothe the soul. I fix old appliances for neighbors, the same work I have always done, but now it carries a quiet satisfaction that comes not from endless toil for someone else's benefit, but from the simple joy of earning an honest living on my own terms. I wake up to the smell of coffee brewing, sit with my hands wrapped around a warm mug, listening to the faint sounds of birds, of leaves rustling in the breeze, and for the first time in a long while, my mornings belong entirely to me. The room is mine, the space is mine, and every object around me has a purpose that I chose. Every corner of this home speaks to my decisions, my independence, and my dignity restored. Sometimes in the quiet of the afternoon, my mind wanders to Emma, and I think about the life we once shared, the laughter, the late-night talks, the moments when she was my little girl clinging to me after a nightmare or celebrating small victories in school. A part of me still loves her because she is my child, because the bond of parent and child runs deep, stronger than resentment or betrayal, deeper than the years of struggle to hold her safe. And yet, love alone cannot blind a person to truth. I've come to understand that truth is often harsh and that love must be paired with wisdom, with the ability to see what is real and what is a mask of convenience. The truth I came to accept is that Emma chose comfort, greed, and the wrong partner over respect, loyalty, and the family that raised her. That choice was hers, and no amount of pleading or giving could alter her path. I learned something profound in those quiet moments of reflection, something that changed the way I understand myself and the people around me. I learned that no matter how much you give, no matter how patient, no matter how loving, people can forget your worth if you allow them to treat you as if you are less, as if your years, your sacrifices, your heart, do not matter. I learned that a father may age, his hair may gray, his body may slow, but he never loses the right to be respected, to be valued, and to have his life treated with honor. And if someone, even your own child, tries to push you aside, tries to erase your presence, your voice, your legacy, you must stand firm. You must protect your life, your dignity, and your future. You must rebuild, carve out a space where your heart can breathe free, and where the choices you make are not dictated by greed, disrespect, or betrayal. Now, as I sit in my peaceful home, the sun spilling over my small garden, I know I made the right decisions. I acted when it mattered, I protected what was mine, and I refused to allow betrayal to define me. I walk every day with the quiet pride of a man who has weathered storms, who has seen the depths of human selfishness, but who has also found the clarity and strength to reclaim his life. And though the memories of what was lost linger, they no longer haunt me. They remind me of the lessons I earned through hardship, the lessons of patience, discernment, and courage. Life is simple now, honest and steady, and in that simplicity I've discovered a peace I never thought possible after betrayal, a peace that comes from knowing that no matter what others do, no one can take away your dignity if you guard it fiercely and act when the time is right. I have learned that life is not about how much you give to people who may not value it, but about how you honor yourself, protect your heart, and create a space where respect, love, and integrity are not optional, but guaranteed. And in that quiet home, with the morning light falling softly across the walls, I finally feel the full weight of that lesson and the freedom it brings. A freedom I earned the hard way but will never let slip away again.